I never imagined I'd be typing this, but here I am, sharing my life's biggest betrayal on an anonymous forum. My wife and I were married for almost 30 years. We had 2 kids, our son Michael and our daughter Kayla. I truly believed we'd grow old side by side, building memories and watching our grandchildren run around. That belief died when Kayla showed up on my doorstep last year and revealed the truth about what had really happened back when Michael was still in high school. I've spent the past months unraveling the twisted lies that shaped my relationship with my own son, and now I'm determined to get the revenge I deserve. Michael was always closer to my wife, while Kayla tended to bond with me whenever minor family disagreements cropped up. I never saw anything sinister in it. But when Michael turned 16, he changed. He grew distant and resentful toward me, stopped asking for my advice, and avoided our usual outings. I chalked it up to teenage angst. We'd argue and he'd shout that I didn't understand him. His mother intervened and gave me rationalizations. I thought I should let him figure out his own feelings. I spent years trying to repair our bond, but he only drew further away. By graduation, he barely spoke to me. Eventually, he cut me off almost completely, except for obligatory holiday visits. Then, 4 years ago, right after I retired, Michael stopped visiting altogether. The only connection we had was a group text my wife moderated. It tore me up inside, wondering why my own son seemed to despise me. I never suspected the betrayal that was festering behind the scenes, nor the lies woven by the person I had trusted most. Here we truly are at last, finally. I never blamed Kayla for staying in contact with her mother. They always had a good relationship, and I wasn't about to weaponize my divorce plans. Because yes, once Kayla told me everything, I knew there was no salvaging my marriage. It turns out my wife had an affair around the time Michael was 16. She'd started seeing a coworker from the accounting firm where she used to work. Kayla was only 12 then, but she caught her mother lying about late nights at the office. Like any curious kid, she snooped. She found texts on her mother's phone, read some explicit details, and was terrified to tell me. Instead, she confronted her mother. My wife reacted by swearing Kayla to secrecy. Kayla was scared and agreed, but always kept that knowledge locked inside. Meanwhile, Michael discovered something was off, but never got the full story. My wife manipulated him, implying that I was the one who'd stepped out on the marriage, or that my controlling nature drove her to seek emotional support elsewhere. She fed him twisted half-truths, painting herself as the victim and me as the villain. Michael believed her. In his eyes, I was the unfaithful father who broke his mother's heart and forced him to live in tension. That explained his anger toward me. When Kayla grew older, she realized how twisted everything was. She tried confronting her mother again, but my wife refused to come clean. Then Kayla reached out to me, guilt-ridden, for not exposing the affair sooner. She asked if I'd ever cheated on my wife. The question floored me. I had never so much as considered it. That's when Kayla told me everything. In that moment, I felt my world flip upside down, like I'd been asleep for years. I felt betrayed. I confronted my wife that same night. I waited until Kayla left, sat my wife down, and calmly asked if there was anything she wanted to tell me. She gave me that blank stare I'd seen so many times before, the one that often preceded half-hearted excuses. This time, I didn't let her speak. I laid out what Kayla told me. I expected anger or tears, maybe even denial. Instead, she just looked tired, like someone who'd finally been cornered. She admitted to the affair, just once, she claimed. She insisted she ended it quickly, that it was a mistake, and that she kept quiet to avoid tearing our family apart. She blamed me for being distant, for working too much, for never being the husband she needed. None of that mattered to me. The real wound was how she'd manipulated Michael. She tried to spin it, saying Michael had simply drawn his own conclusions, that he'd been upset at me for other reasons. But I knew she was lying. She'd let Michael hate me for her misdeeds. She'd allowed me to be alienated from my son without ever trying to set the record straight. 30 years of marriage shattered by her selfishness. I told her we were done. She scoffed like she expected me to back down. She told me I was overreacting, that Michael's estrangement was partly my fault for not trying harder. She said Kayla was stirring up drama. I just grabbed my coat, walked out, and drove to a hotel. I left her there with her guilt or whatever sliver of conscience she had left. I was livid and felt the painful sting of all the years lost. but I also felt a strange clarity, like a switch flipped in my mind. I wanted revenge, punishing revenge. I contacted an attorney the following day. By then, I was resolved to finalize a divorce. But I also wanted to correct Michael's perception. I couldn't stand the idea that he still believed I'd been unfaithful or abusive. The attorney advised me to gather evidence of the affair, just in case. Kayla handed over screenshots of texts she had saved long ago, plus a few pictures she snapped of her mother's phone. The messages were explicit proof of my wife's betrayal. I also found old receipts from restaurants and hotels that didn't match the dates she'd given me for business trips. It felt like walking back through time, connecting the dots I should have seen years ago. Next, I privately reached out to Michael. I simply said I wanted to meet. He refused. He told me he had no interest in rehashing the past. I almost gave up, but Kayla insisted we not let her mother's lies continue poisoning him. So I wrote Michael a letter. Yes, an actual handwritten letter. I told him that I knew we'd been estranged for years, but that I loved him regardless. I said there was something crucial about our family history he needed to hear. I didn't beg for his sympathy, just asked him to listen. I enclosed copies of a few texts between my wife and her affair partner, with explicit timestamps from that period. Then I mailed it off. 2 weeks passed. No response. I was preparing myself for the possibility that Michael would never contact me again. Meanwhile, my wife kept calling. She left voicemails alternating between threats and apologies. She insisted I shouldn't drag Michael into our marital problems, but she'd done precisely that for years. My anger only grew, fueling my determination to see this through. I wanted justice. Then, out of the blue, Michael showed up unannounced at my doorstep. He looked tense, like he'd been wrestling with his conscience. Without a word, he handed me the pages I'd sent, silently daring me to explain. So I did. I told him everything Kayla had shared, showed him more evidence, and answered every question he fired at me. By the end, I could see the anger in his eyes, the anger that was no longer aimed at me. He realized he'd spent years resenting the wrong parent. I expected him to break down or maybe storm away, but he just stood there, quiet and trembling. Then Michael asked why I never fought back, why I never told him my side of the story sooner. I admitted that I never thought my wife, his mother, would spin such vicious lies. I believed I'd eventually reconcile with my son through honest conversations, never imagining there was a secret this massive behind it all. Michael didn't cry. He just shook his head and said he felt betrayed by the person he'd trusted most. Hearing that broke my heart. Still, I cautioned him that the divorce would get ugly. My wife was already trying to paint me as irrational and vindictive, using Michael's estrangement as proof that I'd been a terrible husband. I told him I didn't need him to pick sides, only that he deserved to know the truth. He nodded and said he needed time to process. Then, almost as an afterthought, he apologized for hating me all these years. I told him it wasn't his fault, that the blame rested squarely on his mother. When he left, I felt a wave of relief, but I also felt that scorching drive for revenge intensify even further. It consumed my thoughts, day and night, relentlessly. My attorney moved forward with the divorce filing. I opted for a no-fault approach initially, hoping to keep things simpler. But I wanted to expose my wife's infidelity if needed, especially if she tried to twist the narrative. Unsurprisingly, she fought back, claiming emotional distress and attempting to secure a larger share of our assets. She even hinted she might call Michael as a witness, expecting him to support her allegations of my supposed cruelty. Her arrogance astounded me. Meanwhile, Kayla had been staying with me off and on. She worked on the other side of town but came by on weekends. She was the one who suggested that I get a private investigator to see if my wife was still cheating. Frankly, I didn't care if she was sleeping with half the city at that point, but Kayla argued that any recent infidelity might further discredit my wife's sob story. So I hired someone to follow her discreetly. Within a week, I received photos of my wife meeting the same coworker at a motel. It was still going on after all these years. I was livid, but not surprised. My attorney advised me to keep this evidence under wraps until the right moment. I agreed. Michael was still distant, but he would occasionally text me short questions about my perspective on certain events from his teenage years. I answered patiently, never pressuring him to see me again. I wanted him to come to terms with the facts at his own pace. Deep down, I suspect he was grappling with guilt. He'd let his mother's lies define our relationship. I understood he needed time. My focus was on building an airtight case for the divorce and preparing for the day I'd confront my wife with every last piece of evidence. The day of reckoning came during a settlement conference. My wife arrived with her lawyer, looking smug and confident. She probably thought Michael's old hostility toward me would keep me from pushing back too hard, but I had no intention of playing nice. We started discussing asset division, and her attorney made outrageous demands: spousal support for an indefinite period, the house, and a hefty chunk of my retirement. She claimed she'd sacrificed her career to care for the family, painting me as an ungrateful husband who'd benefited from her domestic labor. I was prepared for this narrative. My attorney quietly slid the evidence across the table, photos of her current affair and the old screenshots with explicit timestamps. Her lawyer's eyes widened and my wife's face paled. I watched her composure crack. She stammered something about irrelevance, claiming these were old issues. My attorney pointed out that the affair was ongoing and that it directly impacted the question of spousal support. If she was living with or intimately involved with another partner, the court might reconsider her claim. The look on her face was priceless. Then, I dropped the final bombshell. I presented the letter from Michael. He'd written it just a few days before the conference, explaining that he'd recently learned the truth about the affair and clarified that I was never unfaithful. He apologized for not speaking up sooner and stated he wouldn't support any false claims. My wife's lawyer grew visibly uncomfortable. The smugness vanished from her face entirely. All her posturing fell flat, and she looked like a trapped animal. We took a short recess. My wife tried to corner me in the hallway. She hissed that I was destroying our family's reputation. I reminded her that she'd already done that long ago. I refused all mercy. When we resumed, her lawyer tried to negotiate a quick settlement. They proposed a moderate split of assets, some alimony, but nowhere near what they initially demanded. My attorney and I declined. I wanted her to sweat. I wanted to let her know that I would drag every skeleton out of the closet if she pressed her luck. Finally, they caved to more favorable terms. My wife lost her chance at indefinite spousal support. She'd get a smaller monthly payment for a fixed period, and we'd sell the house, splitting the proceeds with a ratio favoring me. It wasn't about the money as much as it was about setting the record straight. By the end of that tense meeting, she looked deflated. The face she once wore, confident, manipulative, self-assured, had vanished. I took no joy in seeing her reduced to that state, but I felt vindicated. For years, she allowed me to be demonized in my son's eyes. She stole precious moments I might have shared with him. If she thought I'd just roll over and accept that, she was dead wrong. Afterward, I sent Michael a text letting him know how things turned out. He replied that he was sorry it had come to this, but appreciated my honesty. He also said he wanted to meet again. We ended up sitting down for coffee a few days later. He admitted he still felt torn, that part of him loved his mother and struggled to reconcile her actions with the woman he once idolized. I understood. I told him he didn't have to hate her, but he needed to see her for who she was. He nodded. Our relationship was far from perfect, but at least the lies were gone. I finally felt free, in a way I never had before. You'd think that would be the end of the story, but I wasn't quite finished. Maybe I should have been satisfied with the divorce settlement and clearing my name with Michael, but the years of pain and estrangement fueled a lingering fury inside me. I needed a final act of retribution. So, when my wife complained about losing face among our social circle, I decided to make sure everyone knew the truth. I hosted a small get-together, inviting longtime family friends, a few relatives, and some mutual acquaintances. My wife foolishly showed up, probably hoping to do damage control. Instead, she walked into a room of people who had already heard my side. I didn't air dirty laundry in a dramatic speech, nor did I wave around the explicit evidence. I simply told people that any rumors about me being unfaithful were false, and that the actual affair had been entirely hers. I explained that I'd kept silent for Michael's sake, but now I felt compelled to clarify. Kayla corroborated my account. By the end of the evening, my wife looked like she wanted to disappear. She tried to spin the story, saying it was complicated, that I'd neglected her emotionally. Nobody seemed convinced. She left early, and I felt no remorse. I wanted her to understand, in no uncertain terms, that this was the consequence of her lies. Some might say I went too far, They might argue that public humiliation is cruel, but I spent years as the scapegoat, losing priceless moments with my son. I owed her no sympathy. She'd sown the seeds of betrayal, and now she had to harvest the results. After that night, I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot finally untied. My revenge was complete. I never regretted it, ever. In the months that followed, I finalized the divorce paperwork, sold the house, and moved into a smaller place closer to Kayla's job. She visits me regularly, and we share the simple joy of watching old movies or trying new recipes in my modest kitchen. Michael and I stay in touch too. We aren't best friends, but the hostility is gone. We've started to rebuild something resembling a normal father-son relationship. Sometimes he asks if I'll ever forgive his mother. My answer remains the same. I don't see how I could. She purposely destroyed our bond for her own convenience. She expected me to shoulder the blame and suffer quietly. I see no reason to grant her absolution. Last I heard, she's still seeing that coworker. They've become more open about it, possibly because she no longer has to pretend. Her reputation has taken a hit, especially among the people who once believed her sob stories. Some have cut her off entirely. Others maintain contact but keep her at arm's length. I don't particularly care. I did what I had to do to clear my name and protect whatever remained of my relationship with my son. I don't wish her well, nor do I curse her. She exists as a reminder of how fragile trust can be. Do I feel better now that I've had my revenge? In many ways, yes. The anger no longer consumes me. I don't lie awake at night obsessing over what could have been. That satisfaction is enough for me. I'm not naive. I know life doesn't always offer perfect closure, but I've found a sense of peace in making sure the truth prevailed. I lost years with Michael, and I'll never get them back. But at least I didn't let her lies stand unchallenged.